The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings.
Waking humanity, one soul at a time. This is the World You Don't Know radio show with your host, Nick O'Connell.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome along to this week's edition of The World You Don't Know with myself, Mick O'Connell. I wasn't here last week. I think an old show, or maybe a music show, was put out last week, so sorry for anybody that did listen and think I'd be here live. I wasn't here last week. I wasn't that well last week. I wasn't physically sick. I was just a little off, so I decided to take a day or two off. Anyway, I'm back in the hot seat, and I've got a good guest lined up for you tonight. Now, the subject we're going to talk about tonight can be, I suppose, it's a very sensitive subject, particularly for Irish people. We're going to be talking about what we were taught, should I say, in school, was the famine. And it was something I'd always questioned, even as a child. Now, we were taught that in 1845 to 1850, there was a famine in this country and millions of people starved and millions of people emigrated, thus slashing the population down to 3 million plus. But anyway, decimating most of the Irish population. And what I couldn't get my head around at the time, in schools especially, and this is as a 10 and 11-year-old, when they're telling you in school, oh, you know, there was a famine, there was no potatoes, and everybody starved. And what I couldn't get my head around, would you not eat a rabbit? Do you not like broccoli? Would you not eat apples? Would you not eat fish? Would you not kill a cow? Kill a pig? Where was all the other food? You know, if there's a famine, fair enough, there's a famine, but that only affected one crop. What happened to all the other food? And it's not, even in school when we questioned that, we were told, oh, shut up and listen. This is the story you're being told. You've got to believe it. This is our history. And it was drummed into us as children in school, but I always questioned it. Now, a book has been written by a gentleman called Chris Fogarty from Chicago in America. Now, he's an Irish American. And the book is called Ireland 1845 to 1850, The Perfect Holocaust and Who Kept It Perfect, i.e. who covered it up. It's a very interesting book. Now, I haven't had the pleasure of reading the book, and I do look forward to reading it, but I have listened to previous radio interviews that Chris has done, and I must say, he puts across a very cogent argument for there being an attempted genocide of the Irish people. And don't get me wrong, the British are well known for this practice. They did it in Australia, they did it in New Zealand, it was done in South America. This is how they wipe out populations, indigenous populations they want to get rid of. They starve them. It's cheaper than shooting them, I suppose, you know, just starve them all over. Anyway, I'm going to go to Chris and I'm going to see what happens. Good evening, Chris.
Good evening.
Listen, you're very welcome along to the World You Don't Know show. Very interesting subject, to say the least. Can you give me a little bit of background about who you were and what led you to write this book?
Yes. I was born in Chicago, raised outside Castlereagh, on a little farm outside Castlereagh, County Roscommon. We used to walk past the Castlereagh workhouse every day going to and from school. And I always believed it was what they said it was, a famine, until I was doing my grandfather's biography. I had never known him. Born in 1839, died in 1924. He was a British soldier. When he was born in the shadow of Lord Ashbrook's gallows outside the castle gates, up the hill and outside the castle gates of in County Laois. It'll come to me in a second. So when he was 18, he joined the British Army, and he died when my father was 21 years of age. So I never knew him. In doing his biography, I went to the British Public Record Office at the time. Now it's the National Archives in Kew, Surrey, outside London. And in researching his time in the British military, he was in New Zealand, and they did the Maoris, what the same army had done to his own parents earlier. And he went to India and Australia, a very sad life, but he had no options. He was a little bit like, we'll say, an Iraqi in Iraq, a young Iraqi in Iraq today, who if he doesn't serve the conquerors, he might just not make it. So in any event, he said his money was sent to the Durrow County Laois. I got it. So even the Ashbrooks owned Durrow Castle in Durrow, around the gates of that castle. The town of Durrow sprang up because of the spending power that came from that landlord. Each of these landlords would have the total spending of everything produced by everything on their estates, and their estates were typically 20 or 30,000 acres. And they had the spending of all wealth produced by the Irish people on those estates, except for starvation material given to those people, or that they sowed their own little crops on 2 or 3 acres on which they lived. But all the rest of the year, they spent working on the landlord's crops, and those landlords were all taken away at gunpoint by the British Army. So in doing that, I found out that the regiment that my grandfather joined when he was 18 in 1857 was the same regiment that starved South County Galway when he was 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age. I was shocked, because I'd been taught in school that it was a famine, and they didn't say potato famine. That seems to be a growing addition now. It was just called a famine in my young years in Ireland. And so, shocked by this, I did some more research, and I found that more than half the British Army participated in that genocide, because one must call it genocide. I don't use the word genocide in my book and on the cover because no Irish person ever used that word. It was coined by Raphael Lemkin post-World War II to describe what the Nazis had done to the Jews. So genocide was only created in our lifetime. But what was used at the time was Holocaust, starting in 1847. The Cork Examiner newspaper referred to it as Holocaust. So did Michael Davitt in his great book, and many others. So that's the word I have used, Holocaust, in my book. And but I must say, regarding all of us having been so disinformed, not many years ago, one of my fellow classmates in Castlereagh, County Roscommon, asked our local, now retired, Marist brother teacher, "Brother, if you now admit it was genocide, why did you teach us all famine in school?" And that brother, a wonderful, conscientious, very hard-working, dedicated teacher in all other respects, replied, I must say unacceptably in my view today, he said, "I had no choice. I had to teach the curriculum as provided to me by the government." So that otherwise very good man had falsified history, lied to his students, and covered up a genocide his entire teaching career.
Now, can I ask you, Chris, I mean, as I said, when I went to school, we were told that there was a famine and stuff like that, and I mean, I left school when I was 13 years old, and I never really listened to them in school, so I wasn't, I mean, the only thing they ever taught me, I suppose, was how to read, write and spell correctly. Other than that, I taught myself everything I know in life. I took nothing away from school. I certainly didn't believe, at the time, about the famine. I mean, because they were telling me in school, we asked questions in the class, well, why was there a famine? What happened? Well, the potato crop failed. And the first thing that came into my head was, well, would you not eat something else? And when we asked that question of the teachers, we were told to stay quiet and listen up.
Well, you were ahead of me because in my class, we didn't even have the wit to ask that question.
Well, when we were kids, I suppose, in school, you know, I went to school in the early 80s, and up until, I think, 1984, 85, we had corporal punishment in schools, and I was corporally punished a few times for being out of hand in school, and they'd hit you across the hand with a leather strap 6 times. And the first time it happened to me, that was it, because I didn't come to this country till I was 6 years old. I was actually born over in Germany. So when I came here, that completely shocked me, that kind of behaviour. And I stood up to them straight away, so, you know, I never believed the word out of their mouths.
Yeah, well, it's a shame that all of those teachers lied all those years. I cannot understand it. I think that Ireland might be unique on earth in having a government that permanently conceals the genocide of its own people. I don't get it.
Why do you think they do conceal it? If indeed it is true that, as you say in your book, British garrisons were removing food at gunpoint from this country, and I believe they were. I mean, I've glanced through your book. I've had the opportunity to have a read of a few pages. I've listened to quite a good few interviews that you've done on People's Internet Radio, on Red Ice and a few other places, and I've built up a pretty good picture in my own mind about what's in the book. One thing that strikes me the most about the book is the map. The map of Ireland, where all the garrisons were situated, all around the country. I mean, the country was swamped with them.
Yes. In fact, 67 regiments were stationed in Ireland in those years, and the entire army is just 130 regiments. So more than half of the British Army participated in fact, implemented that genocide.
And what do you think the agenda was? Do you think it was like their final solution for the Irish problem?
Yes, it can be nothing. They can't say, well, they cannot say that it was unintentional. And Tony Blair's a false apology back in 1997 at Mill Street in County Cork, that apology, of course, was another layer of lies. He said, and this was accepted by almost everyone speaking for official Ireland, is that it was an apology which they accept. He said that that Britain stood idly by while Ireland starved. You're not standing idly by if you have more than half your army in the place removing the food at gunpoint. That's not standing idly by.
Yeah, I mean, if they really wanted to feed us, they could have used our army to do the opposite of what they were doing.
But it's even silly to talk about feeding the people, because if you're removing their food at gunpoint, it's silly to talk about feeding them.
I mean, what is the...
do is stop removing the food.
What's the true definition of the word famine? Is that a full failure of all foods?
It's an absence of food, the result of an absence of food. And I must say, in a certain sense, it was a famine, but it was a famine in the same way that, for example, if the people were gassed in Auschwitz, to call the Irish situation a famine would be similar to calling in Auschwitz the time of the air pollution or the time of the oxygen scarcity. It's just a euphemism. There are places on Earth, very, very rarely, where due to drought or locusts or something, there can be a famine. But essentially all famines, at least those in the last couple of 100 years, have been imposed by some government.
And it's usually the policy of said government, or whichever government it is, that causes...
Yes.
Now, can I ask you as well, how did you come upon all this information, like, about the British garrisons and stuff like that? Who gave you that information?
Well, no one gave it to me, but it's publicly available in the public. It's now called the it's called the National Archives in Kew, Surrey, outside London.
Right, the British Archives.
But the British National Archives, and what's more, they cannot delete it because it is core British history.
And it's enmeshed with lots of other history as well. If you remove some, it'll just make a mess of the rest of it. Can I also ask you, at that time, in 1845 to 1850, one thing that was never reported in this country was the non-production of Guinness or other related type products that they would need grain to manufacture, you know. So all the breweries that were in this country, they were still up and running. There was still beer being manufactured in this country, was there not?
Yes. In fact, a delegation of 22 of the most prominent Irish men, you might call them Catholics at the time, Daniel O'Connell and the mayor of Dublin and a few others, the Catholics were just coming out of absolute abasement just prior to that, barely lifting their heads above the parapet. And they went to the British Vice Regal Lodge in Phoenix Park, Dublin, and they pleaded with Lord Heytesbury there to please stop the food removal and to halt all distilling and brewing for a while to leave the grain for the people. But he by the way, their media, and he ignored their request, thereby officially beginning the Irish Holocaust. But he did one other thing. He began the potato famine lie by reading to them from a paper about potatoes and blight and poo-pooing the notion that the blight was very serious. So two things, on that date, November 3rd, 1845, two major events were initiated. One, the beginning of the Holocaust, and number two, the beginning of the famine lie. So it all depends on which side you're on. There are people in Dublin now led by a Michael Blanche, B-L-A-N-C-H, who continues to promote famine. He's got a bus going around, I understand.
I've seen that bus. I noticed that bus about 3 weeks ago in Dublin. The Irish Famine Tour.
Yes, the purpose of the bus is to keep the lie.
Is to keep the lie perpetuated in people's minds. I had an inclination to go up with a can of spray paint and just spray over the word genocide over it. I probably still will.
I would never condone any.
No, I'm joking. But I mean, look,
anything short of that would be very helpful. But we must get the truth. We must redeem the reputation of the approximately 5 million people who were murdered. That lie, that the defamation of their characters, the notion that they improved the world gene pool by falling into a lethal trap of their own making by growing only one. All of that kind of stuff is just shocking.
Yeah.
And it's an awful thing to, first of all, murder a people, and then later to say that they died of their own stupidity. It stuns me. It stuns me that the people of Ireland would have a government that's actually doing that against their own people. I don't get it.
But our ex-president, Mary Robinson, I was listening to the interview you done last night with Vincent on People's Internet Radio. A great interview as well. I was listening to it today to catch up and to get fresh in my head about what we could talk about here tonight. He mentioned something about Mary Robinson, something that she said that was shocking. Now, I can't remember exactly what it was. Do you remember what it was?
Yes, I do indeed, because we have it on paper here. He referred to a speech she made in Chicago.
That's it, yeah.
I wasn't in Chicago in those years. I was working all over the world in South America and Borneo and different places as a civil engineer. But at the Strokestown so-called Irish Famine Museum, as you enter, they will give you a little brochure with a statement written by then-President Mary Robinson, in which she refers to 1845-1850 Ireland as Ireland's greatest natural disaster.
A natural disaster.
That's as bad as Tony Blair's so-called apology. But we can understand that Tony Blair might lie on behalf of the British government, but why would the President of Ireland lie against her own people?
Well, I mean, the one way I would look at that is, if you listen to People's Internet Radio, you know, Vincent and other radio hosts over there have been talking, along with Billy Maguire, whom I know personally myself, and Christina Delaney, talking about the fact that the Oireachtas that exists in this country today, i.e. the seat of government, is a British construct.
Yes, I'm quite clear on that now. It should be.
So that to me would explain why Irish politicians,
the Royal Oireachtas.
The Royal Oireachtas, yeah.
We've seen that for the last 30 years here in Chicago. The time of when the Birmingham Six were tortured into signing false confessions, many of us and people in Ireland, honest people, the few, I shouldn't say the few, the honest people of Ireland were outraged. We went to the Irish Consul General here in Chicago and asked, what about he said terrorism. He warned us away. He's supporting terrorism.
And yet and yet it has since been proven that those 6 men were innocent, along with the Guildford 4.
Yes, right. And so, but there was that, and then later, the time of Bloody Sunday, he opposed any kind of support for the people who were murdered by the British troops on Bloody Sunday. He stood in our state legislature in Springfield, Illinois, the state capital of Illinois. He stood with the British Consul General, arguing against enactment, arguing against Irish America, arguing against Ireland's interests, and arguing against fairness. He wanted to keep the old job discrimination against Catholics in the 6 counties operating. Our law required that at least American companies operating in the 6 counties, and 25 companies at the time employed 11% of the working population of the 6 counties. But the Irish Consul General did not want them to be employed. He did not want them to be treated fairly, because he stood alongside the British Consul General and argued against enactment. We defeated him. He lost. We won.
And there you have it. Listen, Chris, I need to go to a quick commercial break. Do you mind hanging on the line for a couple of minutes?
Sure.
That'd be brilliant. Folks, we'll be back in a couple of minutes with Chris Fogarty. Talk to you very soon.
Broadcasting to Lucan, this is Liffey Sound. 96.4 FM.
Now, folks, you're very welcome back. Chris, you're still with me?
Yes, I'm here.
That's great. Listen, prior to 1845, what was the population of Ireland?
You know, I don't pursue the murder toll. I've left chapter 6 in my book to a Cork man in England, who had done a census specialist who has worked on that and done a fine job. It's a very lengthy chapter. But in very, very general terms, the population was between 12 and 13 million. The census came nowhere near counting the people. The constabulary were used at the time to count the people, and the people feared the constabulary. Even though it was nearly half Irish at the time, it was all led and controlled by English. And I must say, I have a first cousin once removed who was an RIC man killed by the IRA in Thurles in 1920. They weren't royal until after 1867, I think it was, when they did a good job in keeping Irish rebels down in one particular incident. They were just the Irish Constabulary prior to that. But they were Britain's eyes and ears in Ireland.
Now, can I ask you as well, Chris, most of this food, as you were saying there earlier on, would have been grown on, landlords' estates and stuff like that. How many people would they have working on their estates? And why did these people, if they knew what was going on with the food, I mean, maybe for the first year they probably wouldn't have copped on what was happening. But certainly in year two, I think most people would have realised at that stage, they're taking the food out of the country, they're holding us at gunpoint. And fair enough, they didn't have weapons to fight back, I understand that. But why would, were people forced to work, like slaves would be?
No, and they probably weren't excessively productive because, as you know, they were being robbed of their product. But it was life and death for them. They had to do a certain amount or they would be evicted. And the eviction at the time was essentially a death sentence for most. Most died. The only case I know actually of a family that wandered away after an eviction was a man near Limerick City, outside Ennis, who made his way to Ennis into Limerick. And we know that he passed through Bangor-Erris in northwest County Mayo only because one of his sons, Bernard, died there. But they wandered up and were passing through Bangor-Erris, County Mayo, when one boy died. It's just tragedy. I think that the towpaths along the canals to Dublin are probably the area alongside those towpaths are probably one long mass grave. And of course the workhouse grounds, they typically have thousands. Each workhouse would tend to have thousands buried within its own grounds. My classmate and very good friend, Johnny Crahan, with whom I went to school in Castlereagh, became an excavation contractor. And when the government approved a housing development, a housing estate they call it there, atop the Castlereagh workhouse grounds, my friend was the excavation contractor, and he told me he excavated all kinds of bodies. But one thing that hurt him quite a bit, it really hurt him. He had young children at the time. He spent a few days loading up the piled up bodies of toddlers, of little children, loading them up into a truck and hauling them away to a dump.
And with these victims of the...
And shut down the whole project. The number of houses was reduced in order to avoid the areas of densest population of bodies. But they were buried in piles. Pits were dug, and they were thrown in 8 or 10 or 15 deep, and then the pit moved on as the people were dying. In Castlereagh, there was a wooden chute built on the western wall overlooking the town. And as the bodies died up on the second floor, they were shoved through an opening and down the chute, and from there into the pit. But all of that's available as lore. But my book doesn't depend upon lore. I don't use lore in my book. I use official records, absolutely indisputable records. So that, for example, my book lists every single, and my wife was with me going over the Ordnance Survey maps that were just completed in 1845. The Ordnance Survey maps shows, and we have recorded all of them. They're listed by location. Every single grain mill, grain kiln, distillery, brewery, woolen mill to show beef and mutton, or show mutton and lamb. What else? All the food processing capabilities of the country, including flour mills, everything else. All that is listed in my book. And so the notion that they grew potatoes is a laughable lie if it weren't so deadly. But what I don't understand is the number of people. I just had like Joe Duffy on his Radio 1 show, RTE Radio 1 show, who interviewed me in a very hostile fashion.
Yeah, I heard about that. He was
want any memorials to go up over those mass graves, and I don't understand what his problem is.
Well, maybe he's just trying to keep perpetuating the lie, I suppose, that trying to drum it down people's throats that there was a famine.
Yes, well, he certainly did that. He had about 5 people on. Each of them didn't know anything. Some of them were posturing as historians, and they seem to know nothing. They can't refute, or they don't even try. More importantly, they cannot try to refute a single sentence of my book.
So you're saying they just come on the radio too?
Irrefutable, and I hope that the listeners will understand that fact and opinion are two very different things.
Oh, without a shadow of a doubt.
My book contains very, very little opinion, and all the latter half of the book, made up of what I call exhibits. Those exhibits are all fact. There's no opinion in those exhibits, and those exhibits prove genocide. And I must say, my book takes off where Tim Pat Coogan's book leaves off. Mine starts where his takes off. He accuses the British of genocide based upon the hostility of the British bureaucrats in Ireland and London at the time. And I must say, in my opinion, as I wrote in an Amazon.com review of his book, that's a little bit like conducting a Nuremberg tribunal based only upon Hitler's Mein Kampf. It's circumstantial evidence, but there's no proof there. My book proves the entire thing. It proves it. It names exactly which regiment, and what's more, the map that you say you like it's not even a snapshot view of a single moment. What that map is it shows the location of the named regiments during their longest stints of food removing.
Now, can I ask you, Chris, when you were doing your research into these regiments, and I mean, for anyone that wants to see the map, you can give out the name of your website at the end. I'm sure there's a map on your website.
Yes.
For anyone that wants to see this map is absolutely swamped in regiments. There isn't a corner of Ireland that doesn't have these regiments in it. Now, when you were doing your research in the British archives, did it say what they were in this country for? What their mission was?
Oh, no. In fact, you'll never find anywhere throughout these records that they were in South Africa to enslave the people and take their gold, or they were in Rhodesia to take the diamonds, or they were in Australia for anything. No, they don't say what they were doing. But you see, once you know that the food was removed, once you know, from as my book shows, the torrent of food being shipped out of Ireland and into England, then you know that those army were posted there for that reason. There can be no other reason. And what's more, Lord Clarendon in 1847 said, but for the onerous duty of escorting of provisions was the word used for foodstuffs at the time, the army in Ireland would have little to do. There you have it.
So that was their main function, was to help remove the food. I mean, we have that famous song here. I'm sure you know the famous song, The Fields of Athenry. And there's a line in it where he says he stole Trevelyan's corn so the young could see the morn. I mean, Trevelyan, historically, he wasn't a very nice man. I mean, he did not like the Irish people. But I mean, even that line in the song is very telling. It's Trevelyan's corn, and you could apply that to the rest of the food, not just the corn. I mean, I think that was just a euphemism for all of the food in Ireland.
Yeah. It should be mentioned here, I think, that it wasn't just one bureaucrat or a few bureaucrats. At the time, the landlords in Ireland were much of England's government, much of the British government. They sat in the House of Lords in London. And the laws they made were self-serving laws. They're the ones who, while in London, could send the army into Ireland. They were the beneficiaries of the robberies of Irish labor, because all of Irish labor was robbed at the time at gunpoint. All of that food was the result of Irish labor. There was no army of English spalpeens coming across to plow and to plant and to reap Ireland's harvests in those years. In fact, at the same time that the Irish were creating those harvests in Ireland, they were doing much of the same for the English and the Scots in those countries. So there was an enormous amount of energy expended by the Irish, huge amount of energy, and and it resulted in that torrent of food, and essentially all of it was shipped out.
Now, can I ask you, I mean...
Tragedy beyond words. It couldn't be clearer. It doesn't require anyone to believe. The facts are there, and the only way one can continue to use the word famine is either to remain ignorant or to use words that you know is false.
I don't use the word famine now. I call it what it is. I'll call a spade a spade. To me, as far as I was concerned, it was an attempted genocide of the Irish people. And, you know, and fair enough, I'm being one-sided here. And
those who were pushing famine all those many decades have now switched. But they switched to present another falsehood, another exculpatory title, and that title is Gorta Mor, or Great Hunger. That's one more lie. It excuses, it gets the perpetrator off the hook. And so anyone who you hear using the word Gorta Mor or Great Hunger, you would respect, honor the dead by correcting them.
I mean, you know, people don't willingly go hungry. You don't deliberately starve yourself to death, unless, of course, you're on a hunger strike. And I don't think the majority of the population were on a hunger strike at the time. They just had no access to food.
Well, there were some mighty forces against the Irish people at the time. I have a lot of respect for all of what the church has done in Ireland for all these years. All the priests and nuns and brothers I've known have all been exemplary people. But consider that the Bishop of Killarney has a public statement that how proud he is to live in a country where an Irish farmer will starve his own children so as to pay his landlord's rent.
He actually said that.
That's queer talk for a religious person.
It is. It's very strange talk, that now. I mean, that's... You know, this sounds like a psychopath to me, that someone who would think like that, you know. Absolutely zero empathy.
Yes, so it's a very sad world. So Gorta Mor and Great Hunger really have to go because they are euphemisms to conceal a genocide. And again, the reason I use Holocaust is that that's the word that was used in print to describe what was done to Ireland at the time. That was the word used in print at the time and ever since. But I must say we are being falsely educated away from it by the entire Irish school system. And the government today is deeply involved in this cover-up. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, the Royal Oireachtas was discussing an Irish Famine Commemoration Day to be held sometime in spring, April or May. Imagine. And the only reason for the so-called Irish government to try to establish a famine commemoration day is that November 3rd is growing as Irish Holocaust Commemoration Day for the last 25 years or so. It has been commemorated in essentially all the Anglophone countries. Ireland, America, Canada, England, Scotland, Australia, New Zealand, and a few other non-English speaking countries. November 3rd, that date is Irish Holocaust Commemoration Day because of what happened in the Vice-Regal Lodge in Phoenix Park when Lord Heytesbury refused to consider the urgent beseeches of his visitors to stop the food removal, and he read to them instead. He ignored them and read to them from a paper about potatoes. So there you have it. Now I must say, at the same time that the Irish Holocaust is covered up, we see people in Ireland insisting that what Hitler did only to the Jews, to nobody else, just what he did to the Jews, must be solemnly commemorated. And one would wonder how many commemorations, how many memorials are there in Israel to the Irish Holocaust? And I don't think there's any kind of an effort to recognize that crime.
So you don't even talk about it in this country, let alone anywhere else in the world. I mean, don't get me wrong, you've written your book and it's a brilliant book. And if this is true, I mean, this truth does need to be revealed. I've no doubt that very plausible and true. I don't think the famine, for me, holds any weight. It never did. And for most Irish people, it doesn't hold any weight. They just don't like talking about it, you know. I don't know why they don't question it, to be honest with you. It should be questioned on a national level, but it's not for some reason. So that only leads me to believe then that there's a cover-up going on, and it's still going on to this day. Because they're still drilling it down children's throats in school.
The Royal Oireachtas, at least 2 weeks ago, was debating that in order to establish a new false state to commemorate an event that never happened, a famine. There was no famine other than a criminally created one. That's a different matter.
Yeah.
And that's what they're covering up.
Well, I think for Mary Robinson to call it a natural disaster, I mean, that's very telling indeed.
Well, it got her a long way in a career because she told that lie. She was considered safe by the world's neocons to abet the genocides going on today.
Yeah, and she was the European...
free reign for a few years. But
wasn't she the UN Commissioner for Human Rights?
Something one day that was slightly sympathetic to the Palestinians, and that was the end of her career.
Yeah, but maybe her conscience got the better of it. That's why she was sympathetic towards them, you know. Hopefully it was. Can I ask you, Chris, did this have any effect on Dublin at all? Like, what was the situation in Dublin during those years?
Dublin.
Huh?
It has to. There must be a multitude. Hundreds of thousands of people walked toward. It's my understanding, walked toward Dublin. Now here we are into the area of opinion. This is not proof now.
Right.
Some wandered just in all different directions, but I would suspect that many would head toward where the food was going, down along the canal, the Royal and Grand Canals to Dublin, to the port for export. And I would think, and Dublin being the seat of power in Ireland at the time, they probably headed there looking for justice. And so the canals along the way, and Dublin itself, must have huge burial grounds. And the Irish government has been covering them up for a very long time. They're just not starting now. So there is a current desecration going on in Dungannon town, County Tyrone, as we speak. The local officials and the local news media do not want to know.
And what's that?
It's a construction going on top of what was Dungannon Workhouse mass grave.
Right. And do you think the Irish government have the records of all these workhouses and those who died in them, like their names?
They're certainly available, but I think they're in very bad hands. I think those records are in the hands of people who will not let them see the light of day.
They don't want the truth getting out, if indeed that's exactly what it is. Chris, listen, I need to go to one more commercial break. Do you mind hanging on for another couple of minutes?
Sure.
That'd be brilliant. Folks, we'll be back in 2 more minutes with Chris Fogarty. Talk to us very soon.
Local programmes, local presenters, local news. Tune to Liffey Sound 96.4 FM.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, you're very welcome back. The text line for the studio is 08706271138. I think it's still working, but if you have any comments or anything like that, you can also leave a comment on the Word You Don't Know page on Facebook if you're listening in. Anyway, I'm going to go back to Chris. I've got about 10 more minutes left and then we'll have to wrap things up then. But an interesting conversation nevertheless. Chris, you're still with me?
Yes.
Listen, I just wanted to... we've got about 10 more minutes left. Can I ask you, what kind of opposition have you come up against in relation to your book?
Well, I find no one attacks the book because it is irrefutable, but the attacks are coming from memorials that my wife and I are installing over Holocaust mass graves. And one in Killally, County Louth, and one on the Belmullet Peninsula have been blocked by the local parish priests. One in Kilbegnet, Craigs County, Galway, was blocked for a long time by the Bishop of Elphin, who was his diocese. And the people who had shown up at one benediction inauguration of a mass grave memorial that we put up in Ballyglass, Ballymoe County, Galway, and asking, in fact, 4 different groups came to me asking me, could I help them get memorials up in their communities at their local mass grave, and I agreed to do so. We were discussing it with the people of Kilbegnet, when 2 months later, while we were still discussing it off and on, the mass grave of baptized Catholics outside the wall of consecrated ground were transformed I guess, in a miracle that is bound to guarantee, I think, canonization, Bishop Christopher Jones transformed those bodies who were outside the wall for 150 years inside the wall. And he did that by having the 200-year-old cemetery wall, part of it, taken down and enlarged to include that area. So we have this action. And then he put up a memorial to babies, to unbaptized children. And on the day of that inauguration, the entire conversation and homily by this bishop was all about unbaptized children. So he also converted baptized Catholics who were starved to death by a government. He converted all of them into unbaptized children. You wonder, why would he even think of doing such a thing?
Very strange.
Why cover up a mass murder?
Now, can I ask you, Chris, how many of these sites do you think there are around the country?
You know, I wish there were a whole lot more. I'm being blocked maybe more than I am being successful. And what's more, my wife and I have limited resources. We'll put up as many as we can. But we know that others are following suit. They're planning on putting up similar ones in other locations. But I fear now that Joe Duffy might have succeeded in intimidating monument makers in Ireland, intimidate them away from their own livelihood by in fact interfering in their incomes, by terrorizing them into not taking such work. They won't say why, of course, because it's so dishonorable. And these priests who are involved, they don't want their names known. They try to avoid being named, and so they get the monument makers to just say they can't take the work and can't explain why.
So can I ask you, do you think the present day establishment are worried about this book because if all this does come out and then records are released, etc., and people start finding out more and more and more that some of their ancestral relatives will be implicated in this, and i.e. the shame will carry on to them, if that's one way of looking at it, you know? Do you think that's probably something that could be a possibility behind?
Well, it shouldn't affect Ireland because the essential perpetrators were almost all English lords.
But they must have had some Irish collaborators, though.
Repatriated, they all left Ireland. Those who were not already living in England on their English estates, they left Ireland. They were bought out by the British government, and they left Ireland between 1900 and 1910. And so they're all gone, and their children don't live in Ireland. So I don't see any Irish repercussion. I think that the reason for covering up that genocide is that genocide is quite popular among the 1% who are now ruling the world. And they do not want past genocides to be noticed because they're posturing as democratic governments. That's just a guess. I can't fathom why any nation or any group would conceal a genocide. Even the perpetrator, one would think in time, they would have to admit and atone. But there's no indication of that yet.
Can I ask you, do you think the British did this over that 5-year period because in their eyes they had no choice? They had to take all of our food because they couldn't get it from anywhere else? Or do you think they could have just got food anywhere they wanted and it was an attempt to genocide of the Irish people?
It was definitely, it couldn't be other. They can't have been unconscious of what they were doing. As they removed the food, the people started to die, and the more they removed, the more the people died of hunger. There was a direct connection between the food removal and the death of the population, and so it couldn't be clearer. And they cannot. It's simply not deniable. It's not as if they died of something else. In fact, there were plenty of other diseases came along, but they were all a direct result of malnutrition.
Yeah. Well, that always, we've seen that in Africa and places
and
like that.
You asked a bit ago about the news media of the time. It just happens, I've done some research on that very recently, and in 1845-50, there were precisely 100 newspapers in Ireland, and 99 of them were Protestant-owned, that's owned by what was then called the ascendancy, the very people perpetrating the genocide. One of them, The Nation, was doing its best, but it was swamped. And what's more, its publishers and editors were being arrested.
And they were trying to get the truth out at that time?
Yes. And Nassau Senior, of course, admitted that what the government is doing, that if the policies underway, he said, were not strong enough, that the way things are going, that only 1 million would be dead by the end of 1848. And that was not nearly enough.
They needed to get rid of most of us. I mean, as you said earlier on, there was nearly a population of somewhere between 12 and 13 million in this country.
I think the figures. Well, you see, there's a problem with that. One can look at the correction factors inserted by Captain Wynne and a few others, and it seems that it was almost certainly between 12 and 13 million, and they ended up with something like 5 point some million. In any event, there was a 6 million person reduction, and about 1 million, we think, got away and survived.
Now, another question I have for you, Chris.
About a 5 million murder toll, it seems.
Right.
And by the way, even though I'm not being entirely specific, that is the 5 million murdered by the British in Ireland is more certain than the 6 million Jews murdered by the Nazis.
There's more evidence to suggest that the Irish were killed. I understand that. Can I ask you as well, millions of Irish people emigrated at that time then. They had to leave on what were known as coffin ships back then. Or what they're being called anyway. They've been called coffin ships to this day. And this is what we were taught in school. Who paid for their passage? I mean, because I'm sure most of these people, if they had no food, they were broke as a joke, they wouldn't have had any money. So who paid for them to leave this country? How did they manage to secure passage to America?
Well, some of them were actually paid by what's called chain migration, but others were entire estates were cleared of their landlords, by their landlords who paid for the vessel and sent them out, just pushed them offshore and got rid of them by the English landlords in Ireland at the time.
Right, so the cost of travel wouldn't have been an issue. Now, one more question, because I do have to wrap things up, unfortunately, Chris. The show's only an hour long. 1845 to 1850. 1851, was there suddenly a glut of potatoes and stuff like that in the Irish market? Was there? Because, I mean, it seemed to have ended after 5 years.
Well, it tapered off in 1850, but it continued. Actually, it could almost as easily be said 1845, 1852. And what's more, the murders continued until the landlords left. The murders continued for so long as the landlords were in Ireland. So the evictions and all the rest continued. All of the executions by hanging, all the transportations continued until the 1870s to Australia. All of that continued. In fact, around our area, in the country areas outside Castlereagh, back in the 1940s, people were still singing about transportation to Van Diemen's Land, which was very common. Huge numbers of people from Roscommon were shipped to Van Diemen's Land at the time for various so-called offences. The whole point was to get them off.
That's Tasmania, isn't it, I believe? Van Diemen's Land is in Tasmania? Or the side of the world, basically. Well, listen, Chris, you have a website. Do you want to give out the name of your website?
Yes. It's www.irishholocaust, all one word, .org.
irishholocaust.org. And is your book available on that site? It is.
Pardon me?
Your book, it's available through the website, is it?
No, it's not. In fact, in Dublin, if you happen to know John Robinson, he and Christine Delaney, they're the only outlets for my book in Ireland.
Well, listen, Christine is a personal friend of mine. I know you see Christine on a regular basis. So if anyone wants the book, you can contact me and I can put you in touch with Christine. That's no problem.
Well done. Well done.
Well, I can do that. That's not a bother.
So I want to thank you very much. I consider that you and I are speaking on behalf of the otherwise voiceless, murdered millions. Without
a shadow of a doubt, Chris. Without a shadow of a doubt. Well, listen, it's been a very interesting show and a very touchy subject, to say the least, to talk about. But I look forward to reading your book myself. And listen, thanks very much for coming on to the World You Don't Know show. I really appreciate that.
Thank you so much.
Talk to you again very soon. Thanks very much, Chris. Now, ladies and gentlemen, that was Chris Fogarty. What an interesting subject, the Irish famine. I've never believed it was a famine, to be honest with you. It was just, did we run out of potatoes? Come on, we don't like potatoes. Oh, should I say, we don't like broccoli, we don't like chicken, we don't eat an apple, for God's sake. The food was being removed out of this country. I think his book does prove that it was. I mean, no one has ever come out with another book proving that it didn't. So, you know, until such a book comes out, I'll believe what I want to believe. Anyway, this has been The World You Don't Know. I'd like to say thanks to Ray Moore for texting in there. He just sent me a message on Skype. Thanks for listening in, Ray. He said he's really enjoyed this guest. Great show. So anyway, folks, this has been The World You Don't Know. And remember, as I always say on my show, the world is full of great people. And if you can't find one, be one. Talk to us all very soon.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society. And we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret society, the secret oath, and the secret proceedings.
Waking humanity, one soul at a time. This is the World You Don't Know radio show with your host, Nick O'Connell.